I'm trusting that the lines to New York are going to be working rather well so that we can speak to one of the most important and successful documentary makers around today, Oscar-winning, Emmy and Grammy-winning Alex Gibney. Hello, Alex.
Hello there. How's it going?
Yeah, it's going very well. How's it in New York, sir?
All good.
So Mark is here, Mark Kermode is here, who's now going to just do 2 lines on Alex Gibney. Well, and Alex is going to sort of pretend not to listen because he might get embarrassed.
One of the most important documentary filmmakers working today, a double Oscar winner, and somebody who has a reputation, a deserved reputation, for taking on particularly tricky subjects and finding a way through them that not only cut to the heart of the subject, but also have broad mainstream appeal.
And your new movie, which is out next week, is called Citizen K. Introduce us to this film and the extraordinary Mikhail Khodorkovsky. That's you, Alex.
Oh, that's me.
Yeah,
that's over
you.
to me. Yes,
that's over to you. It's your film.
I was really intrigued by his story. I mean, here's a guy who was the richest man in Russia, and then he went toe to toe with Vladimir Putin. Putin put him in prison, a sort of Siberian gulag near the Mongolian border, for 10 years. Under Western pressure, he was pardoned and now lives in London and sort of protests against the Putin regime in exile. He's a fascinating character.
And why did you decide that this was an ideal subject for one of your movies?
Well, I'm interested in power, and I wanted to see how power worked in Russia, and I'm also interested in abuses of power. And it won't surprise you to learn that in the United States, anyway, a lot of people started paying more attention to Russia, after the 2016 election. Mm-hmm. And I also think that we didn't, part of what was fun about doing this film was to really dig into that post-Soviet Russian history, to talk about how Russia changed, its brief attempt at democracy, its kind of sliding into gangster capitalism, which is where it is today. But, to understand that, you have to go back to when communism ended. And that's really the beginning of the Mikhail Khodorkovsky story.
Even though it's sort of in recent living memory, it was a fascinating reminder about that race, as you're talking about, from communism to capitalism, and not just going over centuries, as happened elsewhere, but that it happened so fast, it was like the Wild West.
It was like the Wild West, and the movie really is kind of structured as kind of a cross between a gangster film and a Western. I mean, it was full of violence. There were a lot of murders. It was sort of a Wild West period of capitalism when nobody knew what the rules were, and they were making them up as they went along.
And the word oligarch has been around for a long time, but is now sort of primarily associated with this period in Russian history. Just explain a little bit, Alex, how, and it's explained in your film, how the oligarchs turn up and they kind of carve Russia up, and one has oil and one has broadcasting and one has real estate.
They do. They do. I mean, the oligarchs were the ones who understood how this capitalist game worked, and they took ruthless advantage of it. But particularly, there was a moment in 1996 when Boris Yeltsin is running for re-election. And Yeltsin, was in a terrible position in the polls. I think it was like 3%. And also the government didn't have much money. Didn't have money to pay pensions, didn't have money to pay salaries. And so a deal was struck, an unholy deal in which the oligarchs basically said, we'll give you billions of dollars, we'll loan you billions of dollars in exchange for, and as collateral, we'll ask for shares in some of the largest state companies, oil, aluminum, and media. And that's what happened. The government, of course, defaulted on its loans, and these oligarchs, 7 men who ended up controlling about 50% of the Russian economy, ended up with sort of the crown jewels of the Russian economy.
Yeah, so here comes Citizen K, here comes Mikhail Khodorkovsky. How does he fit in with this oligarch period as they carve up 50% of Russia?
Well, he became a banker. I mean, after trafficking in black market blue jeans and computers, he slowly became a banker, started buying up shares in smaller companies, and then he was part of this loans for shares deal. And then out of that, he got a globe-girdling oil company called Yukos, huge company. And that's where he was in the early 2000s, thinking that now that he had all this money and had all this power, that maybe he would try to turn Russia in a slightly different direction. He was looking to merge with Exxon, which was not something that Vladimir Putin was that interested in. And Khodorkovsky also had political ambitions, and that put them, at loggerheads. And there was a famous live television event on corruption where Khodorkovsky accused Putin of corruption directly and frontally, and a few months later he found himself in prison.
So I realize we're giving it like a potted history of what's happening in your movie, but I'm just trying to set up the kind of person that Khodorkovsky is, and when you meet him, and the kind of person that he is. But so, having been the wealthiest man in Russia, he then crosses Putin, and what happens next?
He gets put in prison. He is really trumped up charges, or charges that were hard to prove at the time because the rule of law was so fluid. He gets tried twice. The second time he gets tried, he's accused of stealing his own oil, which is kind of a bizarre sort of show trial that Khodorkovsky plays up. But he ends up in prison in what you would call kind of a gulag-like conditions. And while he's there, he undergoes a pretty profound change, both as a human being and both in terms of his political ideas, and starts to speak out as a kind of dissident against the gangster capitalism that now Putin is in charge of, and also to reckon with the importance of human rights and the rule of law and all of that, and becomes a kind of a powerful moral voice. This from a guy who had been a ruthless exploiter of people. Now he changes, and that becomes the really interesting part of the story.
And what is really fascinating about him, Alex, is that he's gone from being the wealthiest man in Russia. He's just spent 10 years in Siberia, and yet when you're talking to him, he's smiling and laughing. Many other people would not be reacting in that way.
No, and that I think testifies both to his kind of macho nature, but also his kind of inner strength. I think he is still possessed of some anger, particularly toward Vladimir Putin. But that said, I think he came out of those years in prison understanding that he had to take the long view and that he had to kind of get outside himself. And in a peculiar way, it brought him a certain kind of peace and a willingness to look toward a more distant future and to not descend into any kind of self-pity, but to fight for something important, to try to make the world a better place.
How did you find him as an interviewee? When you're talking to him, he strikes me as particularly engaging and fascinating. That certainly was my impression watching your film.
He's terrifically intelligent and engaging that way. Initially, it was difficult talking to him. I spent about 8 days overall, 4 days before I went to Russia and 4 days after, talking to him. And then, of course, we were around London and so forth shooting. But initially, he can be a tough nut to crack. He likes to think in abstract terms, and he's not exactly Oprah when it comes to sort of being open emotionally. But I think over time, he was quite not only engaging but very honest. There was no question he refused to answer, and I found that impressive for a guy who had been surrounded by a virtual army of people when he was an oligarch.
It's also significant that very, very early on in the film, we hear him saying, I'm slightly misquoting, but everything I am is Russian. And there's this sense of melancholy from the very beginning. He says, everything I am, if I could go back there now, that's what I would do. And that does seem to be very important to his character.
Yes, I mean, he is haunted by his exile. And you see him constantly on his mobile device, scanning Russian news sources. He lives in the United Kingdom, but his gaze and his heart is always in Russia.
And in terms of a filmmaker, obviously, when you find a story like this, it's an interesting story, and you've looked at stories like the WikiLeaks story and the Armstrong story. And whenever you come across one of these, how much of you is thinking, how can I make this cinematic? Because obviously, many people will watch documentaries on a small screen, but they're theatrically released documentaries. How much of what you're doing is to do with how much of a film can I make out of this?
Well, I make documentaries mostly, but I'm also very interested in genre conventions. I like them, and my film on Enron was kind of a heist film, and this film is sort of a cross between a gangster film and a western, and I kind of approach it that way. But also, there was something about the oil business and also the breadth and size of Russia that I really wanted to capture in this film. And, so going there was terribly important, and finding a cinematographer, a Russian cinematographer who's extraordinarily talented, to give it that sense of size and scope. I wanted it to be cinematic and breathtakingly visual.
And in fact, the film begins with that statement about him. He said, I was interested in oil because it was so big, because of the vastness of it. So the film kind of sets itself up as existing within a large landscape at the very, very beginning.
Right, that's very hard to control, and it's you see one of those flame pipes that are so ever present in oil operations, and then it melds with the sun in a very kind of powerful way. So I mean, that is in a in a visual sense all about power.
We're in awards season now. You were nominated for Enron Smartest Guys in the Room 2006, won for Taxi to the Dark Side in 2008. How much does it matter that films like this get awards attention, Alex?
To me, it matters because then more people see it. I mean, that's really the big thing. And of course, it's not just me, but I work with a team, and it's great for the team to be recognized. So for those two reasons, it matters. But the most important thing of all is that people see the films that you make and that they capture a moment. And a lot of people are talking about Russia now and Vladimir Putin. And this, I think, is a pretty powerful and instructive film for this moment in time.
What light does it shed, do you think, in your opinion, or what light did you intend to shed on Russia? Because you're absolutely right, we're never more than a couple of days away from another Russian story, whether it be an allegation about trying to get involved in elections in America or the attempted murder of the Skripals in Salisbury. It's everywhere.
It is. I mean, the Skripal case, of course, is part of the story in the film. And indeed, Khodorkovsky has an organization called Open Russia, which attempts to kind of promote democratic ideas in Russia, but also does a lot of interesting work in investigative terms, in terms of digging out stories of corruption or malfeasance. And they were part of digging out the Skripal story. But I think that one of the really powerful things about the story is what it taught me, or digging out the story is what it taught me about this kind of scary period of, let's call it anti-truth, where people in power seem to have a great affinity for blurring the lines of fact. And actually reveling in it. And even when they're caught in a lie, it's like they're looking at us and saying, look, I know it was a lie. You know that it was a lie. We both know it was a lie, but I don't really care, so I'm going to pretend it's true. And that attitude is terrifying, but ever more prevalent. And one of the things I wanted to get at in the film.
When you look back at your extraordinary back catalogue, how much do you think about whether your films change people's view of the world? I mean, for example, I remember going to see We Steal Secrets with my teenager, who was just literally, I've never seen somebody so fired up by a documentary. It really struck a chord. How much does it matter to you that what your documentaries do is to change the way that people see the world?
It matters, but I don't want them to be like. It matters a great deal, but I don't want them to be like vending machines. To me, the more important thing is whether people think about the film after they leave the theater, and the change may be a slower change. It may reverberate with people's minds, in unpredictable ways. I did a film about the U.S. Policy toward torture, which was embraced by the Bush administration during the War on Terror. That film, interestingly, ended up being taught by the Army JAG School in West Point, which was an unexpected result, but one which had a powerful, if focused impact. So you want people to reckon with these films in ways that reverberate over time, and that, I think, is if your son, and I don't know if your son was enraged or inspired, but I
think enraged and inspired, I think, is the thing. And obviously, when you look back through that filmography, is there one that stands out for you as being particularly important? I mean, I remember Going Clear having a very, very strong impact. I remember We Steal Secrets having a very strong impact. I remember Taxi having a very, very strong impact. Which is the one that you're most proud of?
It's hard to pick children. I mean, I'm proud of them all, but I mean, there are ones. Taxi to the Dark Side was very personal to me because my dad was a Navy interrogator, and he died during the making of the film, and I actually included some footage of him when he was on sort of life support as he was talking to me, and so that made that kind of personal to me. Enron, I feel like, has stood up very well over the course of time, and Going Clear, as you mentioned, I think is really important in terms of understanding this idea of the prison of the belief. So, I don't like to pick favorites.
Are there any that you would go back to pick up and continue the story from?
Yeah, it's interesting that sometimes one film ends up leading to another and informing you in ways that you don't really suspect. I mean, I made a film called Mea Maxima Culpa about the clerical sex abuse in the Catholic
Church.
Very
powerful film.
And I was raised Catholic, and it made me think a lot about belief, and that really helped to inform how I approached Going Clear, for example, because I was interested in the abuses of Scientology, the human rights abuses, but I was also interested in how very smart people get locked in a prison of belief. And Mea Maxima Culpa, because I was also a lapsed Catholic and steered emotionally toward the church in ways that I found hard to reckon with my own rational thinking. That taught me a lot about how to approach Going Clear. So over time, ideas reverberate, and one film builds on the next, which I think is important.
Yeah. Citizen K is out next week in the UK. Do you know what you're working on next, Alex?
I just finished a film about a fascinating psychiatrist who's examined more serial killers than anybody in history.
Alex Gibney, speaking to us live from New York. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.